Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Sabbat World's Crusade. Where now we're going to take a break from the larger picture again and focus in on the 81st First Recon, what was once the Tarnith First and Only. The previous Tarnith regiment had been severely depleted command-wise after Ibram Gaunt took many of the remaining commanders, especially after the loss of Colonel Colm Corbeck, with him to the presumed suicide mission on the chaos-held world of Ancreon. The remnants of the Tarnith were therefore, well, not very well led, if at all. Normally, this would be solved by taking the regiment and finding reinforcement personnel, perhaps raising a command echelon from the original world, or meshing them together with another regiment from Tarnith. Except, of course, Tarnith didn't exist anymore, and they were the Tarnith First and Only, so now the Imperial Guard found itself with a reasonably up-to-strength regiment that couldn't really function as a cohesive military unit because it had decapitated itself. An unusual situation, to put it lightly. Fortunately, war, as ever, provides a solution to any problem, and the war on Khan III had provided the solution to this one. During that battle and one of Shebel Red Hand's last desperate counterattack gambles, one Imperial Guard regiment, the 81st Belladon, had stood against his Red Phalanx elite. In a pitched battle of remarkable savage ferocity, nearly 75% of the 81st Belladon were wiped out in a singular confrontation. However, their stubborn resistance saw Shebel Red Hand not only repelled, but the majority of his forces destroyed, or pinned in place for long enough for other Imperial reinforcements to sweep in behind them, cutting them off and destroying them. Due to the bravery of the 81st, therefore, Shebel Red Hand's last gambit was halted dead in its track, and the Chaos Magister was later killed during that action. This, of course, earned the 81st Belladon a great deal of well-deserved glory, but it also cost them 3/4 of their total strength. And as the regiment had only been raised 2 years previously, there weren't a whole lot of reinforcements readily available, as whatever manpower tithe Belladon was expected to contribute had already been largely fulfilled by the raising of the original Belladon regiment. Now, there might still have been an easy solution to simply integrate them with another already existing Belladon force, but somewhat surprisingly, the majority of the 81st Belladon's command corps was still intact. So any regiment that they enrolled them into would not merely be receiving another 2,000 fresh troops. They'd be receiving additional colonels, lieutenants, and command personnel, which would then need to be integrated with the already existing command staff, which is always a pain in the butt, particularly when it comes to a regiment that so recently had won great glory and would probably not wish to give up their own colors to be integrated with another Belladon regiment and have the memory of their great achievement, their victory, be in essence made a footnote of another regiment's history. Bit of a complicated situation there. If they tried to integrate the 81st with another Belladon regiment, the Munitorum would probably have a riot on their hand. Simultaneously, they couldn't get reinforcements, so what to do? Well, fortunately, this is where the Tarnith First and Only comes in, which has a largely intact manpower pool, exactly what the 81st requires, but has also had their command section obliterated via, well, their own choice. So, the top-heavy 81st Belladon joined with the top-light Tarnith First and Only to become the 81st First Recon. Very far from an ideal match, however, as the Tarnith's primary strength, of course, was reconnaissance and infiltration operations, operating as light infantry, whereas the Belladon were, shock troopers. Oh well. As far as the Munitorum is concerned, so long as the numbers are correct, it's a full-strength regiment, even if the various pieces might not mesh particularly well. These sorts of amalgamations of various regiments are fairly common in Imperial campaigns that have been grinding on for quite some time, as is the case, of course, with the Sabbat World Crusade, particularly during this stage of the Crusade, where it has suffered heavy casualties amongst its more elite elements. Wherever possible, they would be sent back to the rear for rest and recuperation, and more importantly, reinforcements from their original worlds. But where that was not an option, slapping the pieces together and hoping that the combined whole wouldn't be complete garbage was pretty much standard procedure. Ideally, such amalgamated regiments would be given the opportunity for a bit of rest and relaxation as well, to try and make sure that the component parts can mesh at least to some degree, but these were not ideal circumstances. And so the 81st First Recon was dispatched to the world of Ancreon Sextus, where the Imperial Crusade had at first attacked and apparently liberated the world quite easily, but then they had ran into serious resistance in 8th major topographical anomalies is perhaps the most correct way of designating them, though to the Imperial Guard forces they were simply referred to as steppe cities, or the ruins thereof. These were 8 massive, apparently prefabricated structures, having been made by the mysterious ancient species that had once inhabited the Sabbat worlds. They were the size of hive cities and sometimes even larger, as was the case with the Sparshad Mons, an enormous mountain-like structure consisting of several thick concentric curtain walls, in between which were gated compartments. Each compartment was its own, absurdly enough, microclimate. You could enter one compartment and it would have thunderous rainstorms as if it was in the deep tropics. The next could be bone dry. The next after that again could be significantly colder or warmer, apparently in complete and utter defiance of all rules of physics and reality. This had already gotten the attention of the Inquisition, the Administratum, the Commissariat, and the Ecclesiarchy. Oh, and the Chaos-occupying forces, who had, upon losing control of the rest of the planet, retreated en masse into these 8 massive steppe cities. And so now everybody was arguing over exactly what they were and who they belonged to. Obviously, the local Chaos forces valued them in some way, but they could simply value them for being extraordinarily easy to defend. With the sheer enormity of the curtain walls, a direct assault through any other way than just passing through the gates and the singular entrance into the ruined city was inconceivable. It would take months of heavy bombardment from countless siege guns to breach even one of the multiple concentric walls. It just wasn't worth it. And so the Imperial Guard would march in through the singular opening and then begin spreading through the various chambers, cleaning out the defenders as they found them. The obvious defensive advantages might be enough reason for the Chaos forces to fall back inside of the steppe cities. There was also, of course, the possibility of the cities themselves holding some sort of ritual significance to the Chaos-occupying forces. That immediately got the Inquisition interested, of course. However, there was then the counter-narrative coming in from the ecclesiarchy suggesting that no, these cities might actually have once been dedicated to the god emperor. They may in fact have been raised, or at the very least used at some point in time, as places of worship. And thus, of course, they needed to be recaptured from the desecrative grasp of the arch-enemy. And then, of course, there was also the competing idea that these structures had been constructed by the aforementioned mysterious alien species that had clearly inhabited the Sabbat worlds at some point previously, and had on occasion dotted it with massive fortifications reminiscent of this. And therefore there might be secrets to be plundered by the Mechanicus. Of course. And a fourth competing argument was the Imperial Guard itself, the military men going, can't we just bomb the damn things? The answer to that was no. No, you can't bomb the damn things. You're going to have to invade them manually. And the 81st First Belladon would be amongst the Imperial Guard regiments sent in to these massive structures, specifically Sparshad Mons. But whilst all of this was going on, another drama was happening deeper behind the lines. As we talked about last time, Ibram Gaunt's primary mission to Geryon, to assassinate a potential turncoat Imperial general, had of course succeeded. But equally, if indeed not possibly even more important, was the information that Gaunt and his team had uncovered. Namely, that Ancreon Sextus was working on his own version of the Blood Pact. Perhaps an even more dangerous and even more aggressive one, the Sons of Sek. But there was no way to get this information off-world and to the Crusade. Obviously, the Geryon Resistance did not have access to an astropath that could transmit the information, nor do they have access to any sort of broadcasting equipment that could guaranteeably reach the Crusade either, even if they could set up an enormous antenna somehow undetected. The only option then was to try to get a hold of off-world transportation. This was unsurprisingly also a rare commodity on Geryon, but wherever there is deprivation, there is also usually smuggling. That was the case on Geryon as well. The Resistance did have some contact with various ne'er-do-well scoundrels who had been visiting the world previously, delivering supplies or weapons. These were hardly the most trustworthy individuals in the world, of course, but it was also the only way to make sure that the message would reach the Imperial Crusade. Assuming that Gaunt and his men wouldn't be betrayed and tossed out an airlock, that is. But considering the sheer value of the information at hand, he was determined that the risk was worth it. And so Gaunt, along with his surviving team members, set out on a very risky trip indeed, out into the Sabbat worlds, where they did actually manage to rejoin the Crusade, but they didn't really look like Imperial Guard soldiers anymore. Months and months in the Until, fighting alongside the Geryon Resistance and the Night Gang, incidentally one of whom had now joined Gaunt's party, Ezra Knight, a very, very tall Night Gaunt partisan who had been gifted to Gaunt after he had saved their village from a band of Chaos Space Marines, which he had somehow managed to kill. Remarkably enough. Anywho, when they made contact with the Imperium arrested them. Unsurprisingly so. They were covered in a certain form of moth venom a greyish paste used as camouflage and protection from the countless diseases common in the Until by the partisans. Gaunt and his band had adopted this tactic because, well, they didn't want to die of swamp fever. Plus, it was genuinely effective camouflage. But as mentioned, it also made all of them look like wilderness hobos. Armed wilderness hobos demanding access to imperial command centers with valuable information. Yeah. Frankly, it wasn't particularly shocking that they were thrown in the brig immediately and set to be executed as chaos infiltrators. Honestly, Gaunt really did not think this thing through. But again, he was of course desperate, and lucky Gaunt, yet again, he encountered a cadet commissar, who was part of the detail overseeing his imprisonment. This cadet commissar was named Nahum Lud, and he saw what none other did. He saw the possibility of these scurvy scoundrels speaking the truth. And if they really did come from Geryon, a chaos-occupied world, and if they really did have vital information, then surely an effort should at least be made to try and figure out if they were telling the truth. After a little bit of initial hubbub in their containment area, Gaunt and his men, along with Nahum Lud, were transported to Ancreon Sextus, where they were set to meet up with Van Voigt, who, of course, would know Gaunt as he was the one who dispatched him on the mission to Geryon to begin with. If Van Voigt could vouch for the identity of these individuals, then that would be proof enough for the Imperium. Now, this too didn't exactly go necessarily smoothly, as it ended with Gaunt and his men breaking out of containment, and Gaunt himself infiltrating Van Voigt's office and pointing a gun at him. Oh, this could so easily have gone so very poorly. But Van Voigt, feeling responsible for having dispatched Gaunt on this mission in the first place, was remarkably generous, forgiving Gaunt for pointing a loaded weapon at him, of course, and even giving him the guarantees and reassurances that he required that he and his men would be treated correctly. Gaunt then properly surrendered himself to Van Voigt's authority and was promptly arrested. I mean, what did you expect? Even that is a lot better than what would normally have happened in such a circumstance, which is that Gaunt and his men would be immediately shot. Again, the guard tends to be touchy about people pointing weapons at their supreme commanders. Although, to be fair, as Gaunt himself would hasten to point out, he didn't actually point a gun directly at Van Voigt, nor did he specifically threaten him. He just showed up in his quarters with a weapon. A tribunal would be created to try Gaunt and his men, not merely for their dubious behavior after being brought, of course, to Van Voigt's command cruiser, but also on suspicion of chaos taint, because, well, they had spent an awfully long time on Geryon, a world occupied by the archenemy, and they didn't exactly look presentable. Furthermore, there were definitely forces within the tribunal, Commissar General Balshin lead amongst them, who kind of just wanted Gaunt's scalp at this point, for the sheer amount of havoc that he had caused, and the people he had embarrassed by doing so. Gaunt and his men were entitled to a defender, a military officer who would speak their case on their behalf and give them adequate legal counsel. Except that's a voluntary position, and nobody volunteered. Except for, yet again, Nahum Lud. I'm probably at some point going to be gushing over how much I adore Lud, by the way. Genuinely, he's probably one of my, if not the favorite character in the entire book, frankly, because he comes across as by far the one that's closest to the ground here. The most of the common man, someone who still has a degree of idealism, who still wants to follow the book of the Commissariat, but still understands that on occasion leniency is required, without going full softy like Gaunt has done in the past. He is an interesting, growing character who is undergoing a learning experience in the harshness of the Imperium, the harshness of reality, and of course combining the fact that he himself is actually a relatively gentle person, and needing to square that fact with being an Imperial commissar. I love Lud, he's great, and if he hadn't volunteered to be Gaunt and his men's defender, then Commissar General Balshin would probably have just assigned them one, who would have thrown them very, very, very far under the bus indeed. So all hail Lud! Lud's the hero! Lud! 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 Also, his name sounds a little bit like whore in Norwegian, which is Luder, in case you were wondering. Anyways, moving on. The tribunal was not exactly tilted in Gaunt's favor by any stretch of the imagination, and despite Lud's spirited defense, it was looking like Gaunt and all of his men would probably go the way of the dodo rather rapidly. But Gaunt had a plan. He made a little bit of a fib, or perhaps, more correctly, a slightly over-optimistic interpretation of reality. Remember that paste we talked about, that Gaunt had covered himself and his men in? The one that was created in part from the poisonous scales shed by an enormous moth native to the Until. Well, one of the primary charges levied against Gaunt, or more like the reason for the charges, was the suspicion of taint. Always a worry in any sort of situation that includes men that had been exposed to a chaos-held world for an extended period of time, and yet there was no real sign of taint on Gaunt or his men. No stigma, no ritual markings, no strange habit of taking trophies, no mutations, no nothing. Granted, Gaunt had been acting a little bit, uncontrollable ever since he came back, but that could largely be chalked up to being put in a cage and threatened with execution 3 times, so that was understandable. And one of the members of the panel about to judge Gaunt was an inquisitor by the name of Velt. Well, Gaunt floated 2 ideas to the jury. One was that he and his men had protected themselves against chaos with the armor of contempt, to always keep hatred of the archenemy foremost in their hearts. But he also introduced the suggestion that mayhaps the venom of the moth from which the grey paste, the camouflage, was created had some sort of anti-chaos properties. Now this sounds like a wild theory. How on the God Emperor's good green terror, blasted brown urbanized terror, I mean, could some moth's shavings possibly protect against the influence of the arch enemy? It's absurd, and yet Gaunt and his crew had returned remarkably intact, and more so, they also brought with them, again, Ezra Knight, a native of the Until, who had been on Geryon for far longer than Gaunt and his crew, and yet he as well, no signs of mutations whatsoever, nor were there any on any of the other Nightgain either, although the Inquisitor had to take that last part on faith, of course. It was a long shot, but it was enough. The tribunal was called off on the authority of the Inquisition, Gaunt would be released without any further punishment so long as he agreed to submit himself to a rigorous series of psychological and physical tests, as well as, of course, to furnish the Inquisition with any and all information that he could have on Geryon, on the Resistance, and on the special pace that had supposedly protected him. This may seem like a bit of an overreach from the Inquisitor, but again, think about the potential here. If by some wild chance this moth's sheddings actually do protect against chaos, it would be the single largest revolutionary discovery in the history of the Imperium. Plenty worth the relatively slight risk of Gaunt and his men somehow still being infected. And there was a second reason for the leniency as well, which Gaunt would be briefed about soon by Van Voits, who had also called in a fair few favors, firstly to get Gaunt acquitted with the aid of the Inquisition, and also to have him return to the front line with his commissar title intact, but not his colonelcy, however. Gaunt would return as a commissar alone instead of a colonel, and he would not be sent back to the 81st First either. Although there was still some concern in the command echelon of the 81st First, particularly with Colonel Wilder, the new leader, that Gaunt would show up and severely undermine his authority. He was told not to worry, however, by Gol Collier, who had now grown to be the most senior, ghost, I suppose, rather than Tarnith, of course, as he's a very Hustite, officer remaining, that the Tarnith had dealt with loss before, and that they had separated themselves as cleanly as they could from their old colonel commissar. But as to the reason why Van Voits had moved heaven and earth to make sure that Gaunt was reinstated, and for his little experiment to perhaps be carried out later as to the moths, was because the Second Front was suffering badly from chaos corruption, and they were honestly grasping a little bit at straws right now. The Second Front had seen an inordinate number of defections, of units routing, of surrendering, of abandoning their positions, or on occasion simply just joining the enemy outright, with certain instances Van Voits claimed to have had examples of, including entire regiments simply switching over to chaos. Not a good situation to be in by any stretch of the imagination. And of course, the occasional defection here and there is to be expected. During long-term combat with chaos, you're always going to see some taint seep in, and sometime that taint will be amongst command personnel, or those who have gravitas within a regiment, who may begin to convince others that it's time to switch sides, that it's time to shoot the officers and join the true champions of humanity. But on the Second Front, it was so much worse than normal. It was as if they were an army already beaten, desperately hanging on against an overwhelming enemy force, wearing them down, the flagging spirits of the men breaking ever more day by day, and yet, in all due technicality, the Second Front was still winning. After defeating the Chaos counterstroke that threatened to decapitate the entire Crusade, the Second Front had defeated the majority of the Magisters threatening it, and was even now aggressively pushing Chaos back and hunting down remaining Magisters, with Ancreon Sextus, of course, being at the top of the list. Now granted, they weren't exactly smashing it, they weren't winning uncontested victory after uncontested victory, but there was no apparent reason why morale should be as low as it was. There had been many theories, of course. Perhaps the enemy used some form of psychic influence to alter the minds of the Imperial Guardsmen, to maximize feelings of dread or loss. Perhaps the initial Chaos terror tactics had been more successful than the Crusade had initially anticipated. Mayhaps the effects had sat deeper in the conquered populaces that were now, after having been liberated, joining up with the Crusade and providing fresh Imperial Guard regiments, and that, too, obviously, was a major factor. Many of the regiments on the Second Front were just that, fresh regiments, unaccustomed to the brutality of warfare. Could that be the explanation? Partially true, but it still shouldn't be this bad. Now, in all due likelihood, a more prosaic explanation is probably more fitting. The Blood Pact were an effective, organized, and well-disciplined enemy. They were pushing the Imperial Guard's buttons in ways that the Guard had not really experienced before. Many commanders didn't quite understand how to deal with it. The average Imperial Guardsman felt that he wasn't fighting just heretical zealots. He was fighting a professional army. A professional enemy army with access to demons and magic and psychers, and all manners of other unfair advantages. Plus, an enemy army as well, I remind you, that in the case of the Blood Pact, were often actively propagandizing towards the Imperial Guardsmen with the aim of recruiting them into the ranks of the Blood Pact. In all due seriousness, it wasn't particularly surprising why the Second Front was experiencing a much higher rate of desertions than usual, but it still had to be stopped, of course. The question was just how? Perhaps magic moth dust would do the trick, and if that wouldn't do it, then surely having one more experienced commissar on the front line would help. And Gaunt moved on pretty much immediately to prove that point, as he uncovered a cannibal ring within the strengths of a Fortis binary regiment. See, the Fortis Binars had resisted chaos for a very long time before eventually being rescued, and it had become a bit of a part of their culture that during some of their lengthy defensive sieges they had resorted to creative menus to make do. Well, apparently some of the Fortis Binars had taken a bit too much of a liking to that. And even after having joined the Imperial Guard, they didn't want to part with their dietary preferences. This may sound relatively minor. It's a cannibal cult, relatively minor. Well, they were sourcing corpses, mainly from the battlefield and so on. It's not like they were just randomly killing people and shoving them in the pot, but what I'm trying to say is that this has a more problematic element here than merely just the eating of human flesh, which already is a bit unusual, I agree, but when you are fighting against chaos, it gets a lot worse. You are not merely just eating your fellow man, which can make people interesting at the best of times, but you are eating your fellow man whilst the powers of the dark gods are intruding upon your mind. So this is obviously a very clear source of chaos corruption, and could at least partially be blamed for the increased rate of desertions within the Fortis binaries, although this was merely one instance, so well, I'm hoping there weren't too many other cannibalistic cults within the Fortis binary regiments, because Gaunt wouldn't be there to find the other ones. But the point is, this was not helping at all. Nor was the fact either that the battles over the ruined cities wasn't really going very well, and for reasons that were frustratingly obtuse. The enemy had, of course, retreated en masse into the fortress cities, these ruined cities, more correctly, the Monsus. But they were just the beaten remnants of a fleeing army. They shouldn't be offering this much resistance. And there seemed to be way more Chaos soldiers inside of these presumed fortifications, then the planet should have already played host too. There were apparently fresh enemy troops appearing out of thin air, which led to a lot of frustration amongst the guardsmen, who were getting upset as why this fighting wasn't ending, why the enemy seemed to be actively replenishing, even as they were pushed further and further into these enormous ruined cities. And just whilst Gaunt was clearing up his little cannibal cult, that situation was made a lot worse, as the arch-enemy mounted an enormous counterattack. The Imperials had seized 7 out of the 11 compartments in this particular steppe city. They had pushed the enemy to the brink of annihilation, and surely all that remained now was a quick bit of cleanup. And yet, all of a sudden, monstrous creatures were attacking the Imperial Crusade forces, and massive numbers of blood-packed troops with armor and artillery were shooting into the compartments, seemingly coming out of nowhere. 2 entire compartments were overrun in as many hours. Complete chaos set in as many of the fresh regiments simply started throwing down their weapons and fleeing outright from these ghastly apparitions appearing from nowhere and surely not being in possession of this many resources in the scant compartments they had left. It disobeyed every single rule of rational reality, and yet the bayonets and the lasbolts coming in at the crusading forces were very much so real. As was the inexperience and on occasion outright incompetence of the Imperial Guard troops. On one occasion, Nahum Lud, for example, ran into an artillery battery, a regiment of heavy guns that were supposed to be supporting the Guard forces against this brand new influx of attackers. But their guns weren't firing. In fact, they weren't even unlimbered or made ready. Why? Because the regiment had no orders to engage, even as the enemy was attacking very close by. Why didn't they have any orders? Lod asked. Well, because the regiment's colonel had evacuated. Why? Oh, he was high-born aristocracy. This was not a place for him. There was danger around here on the front line, so he had left the regiment in the hands of his subaltern, who, again, bereft of orders to actually do anything, did nothing. Fortunately, Lud wasn't made a cadet commissar for nothing, and a bit of direct persuasion later, and the guns were finally in action. Hopefully, it would not be too little too late, as throughout the compartments that were still fighting, the situation was getting very, very dire. The 81st First was holding a 2-kilometer line, along with Horbekan armor and Kolstek infantry, along with element of the Rothberg and Sarpoi armored regiments as well, desperately holding out against increasingly fervent waves of blood-packed attackers during the day and various monstrous creatures coming out to hunt during the night. The ex-Tarnith regiment was getting absolutely mauled, but fortunately they had enough regiments around them with heavy armor to protect them against increasingly massive waves of enemy stalk tanks. It was rapidly becoming apparent for anyone with eyes to see that there was no way all of these enemy troops had been massing within the steppe cities all this time, which led to some investigations and Gaunt, again, rejoining the Tarnith in a semi-official capacity. Getting into contact with one of his previous officers, Major Rawn, and the Chief Scout McCall, they found out the creatures that had been attacking the Imperial Crusade forces during the night, so-called stalkers, were in fact Ogryns, Imperial Ogryns. These ginormous, monstrous things had been a constant hazard since the Crusade forces entered the steppe cities. Huge beasts, often with augmented jaws and claws, would stalk and attack Imperial forces during the night, before disappearing during the day. Many attempts had of course been made to try and hunt these things down, find their burrows and destroy them, but none had been successful even in discovering where they rested. Even the Tarnith and their vaunted scouts had been unable to locate any sort of a network of warrens or hiding places or whatever else, until one of the scouts had seen a creature emerge from solid rock. Okay. The theory that the steppe cities are monuments to the god emperor is beginning to seem a lot less likely. And in a display of good old-fashioned incompetence, the likes of which the Inquisition is all too often saddled with, the Inquisition had already known about this. Well, to a degree anyways. The Ordo Xenos knew that the Stalkers were actually Ogryns. They did not know how they had come to be on Ancreon Sextus, but they knew they were Ogryns, and they knew that they had come from, half a system away? As the specimen that the 81st First and Colonel Commissar had managed to get a hold of and dissected to figure out what it was, had been reported as missing on Moorland, the fortress world that our dear War Master had been grinding himself against for quite some time. And apparently the Ordo Xenos had not then immediately asked the question, how the effing hell did an Ogryn from Moorland end up on Ancreon Sextus? And how did it end up within a steppe city? Ludicrously, they apparently assumed that they were using burrows? Oh, the Ogryn had burrowed from Moorland. What, space tunnels, one must assume then? Normally, as a member of the Holy Ordos myself, I am the first to defend the God Emperor's most holy Inquisition, for whilst their actions may on occasion seem a little bit extreme, a bit strident here and there, often this is merely just the fact that the vast majority of humanity cannot understand the necessity of extreme actions in the face of chaos. This, however, is not an extreme action, this is idiocy. As this information had been suppressed for reasons of morale, which, fair enough, I get that part, but there really should have been some further investigations as to how these Ogryns somehow managed to arrive at Ancreon Sextus. Gaunt could now inform the Inquisitor that the creature, having emerged from a solid rock, appeared to have come through some sort of a portal, that the enormous steppe cities themselves were in some way gateways. That is how the enemy was able to pour in reinforcements constantly, despite not having anywhere near enough space to, well, marshal them, and even less space to keep them supplied. And of course, as misery does ever love company, that was not the end of the problems. After one of the Tarnith scouts had gotten through one of the gateways, he had seen a massing of even greater blood-packed forces on the other side of these gateways. What was currently happening in the steppe cities, in every steppe city across the planet, that was pushing the Imperial Guard to its brink, that was the skirmishing phase. That was the opening gambit in an enormous trap intended to lure the Guard forces into the steppe cities and then overrun them in one enormous, massively well-coordinated offensive across all 8 steppe cities simultaneously, where the Guard would be taken completely by surprise and overrun by vastly superior numbers. This was information that needed to be brought to Imperial Command immediately, Fortunately, Nahum Lud had been instructed by Commissar General Balshin to keep an eye on Gaunt and report back to her if he did anything even mildly suspicious, like, dragging in the corpse of a giant alien monstrosity and beginning to dissect it. That is how Gaunt got in contact with the Inquisition, as General Balshin brought the Inquisitor to Gloviate, as the General Commissar and a strike force moved in to arrest Gaunt. Gaunt knew this, of course. He had allowed Lud to see everything because he knew he would have to report it, and now he could talk directly to the Commissar General and the Inquisitor and tell them about all of this. Swiftly thereafter, bringing Lord Militant Van Voigt into the loop as well, who acted swiftly and decisively. And as he put it as well, this is where a Lord General earns his salt, when he makes a decision based on very little information, and it's got to be the right one. He ordered the immediate, staggered withdrawal of all Imperial Guard forces from every single steppe city across the planet. It would be an enormous undertaking, an incredibly difficult one, and which would cost a lot of Imperial Guardsmen their lives. Disengaging from an enemy is difficult even when they are statically opposing you. When they are actively attacking you, with vastly superior numbers increasing by every hour, lot worse. But even so, the withdrawal had to be carried out with speed and as much efficiency as the often green regiments could muster, because Van Voigt had now given the order to begin bombardment of the steppe cities as soon as practical. The Imperial Guard forces only had until round about midnight to get the hell out of the way, as Van Voigt himself had been a vociferous advocate for simply bombing the steppe cities to begin with, but due to the now debunked theory that they were somehow sacred objects, he had been downvoted. He was not about to give anyone an opportunity to try to do that again, not to mention also the problem of that if this wasn't done quickly enough, nobody had any idea how many blood-packed forces were on the other side of these gateways. If they managed to exit the gateways in sufficient numbers and strike out from the steppe cities, the entire war on Ancreon Sextus might be restarted, but this time with the Imperials at a severe disadvantage. So even though it was risky, even though it was going to be costly, the evacuation needed to be quick. One of the regiments that suffered during the haste was the 81st 1st Recon. Gaunt had been given permission to rejoin the regiment because Van Voigt understood that he needed every single experienced officer he had on the front line, especially every commissar, in order to maintain order during the retreat. This was to be the first and also last time that Gaunt would meet the new commander, Wilder. Wilder understood that he, being at the rear of the retreat, the 81st 1st having been a little bit too successful in holding their positions, would now be the rear guard for all the troops retreating from the steppe city. It was not going to happen, however, without a serious stopgap measure. There was a hill, a beautiful position already prepared and ready for occupation. It sat smack dab in the path of the onrushing blood-packed forces. But any formation that went up there, although being able to block the advance of the Chaos troops, would also be stuck there all but certainly. Gaunt volunteered to take a company of the 81st 1st up onto the hill, dig in, and sell their lives as dearly as possible to allow the rest of the Guard forces to withdraw. Colonel Wilder, however, pointed out that Gaunt did not have an officer's title anymore. he was not a Colonel Commissar, and so it was not his responsibility to do so. Colonel Wilder took his company, and his own private commissar as well, up onto that hill, where they stood and fought and died. It was a successful rearguard action, and the enemy was kept in check for long enough for the majority of the guard forces to get out of this steppe city and the other 7 across the planet before the orbital bombardment began, which would continue for days and quite likely weeks until the steppe cities were completely reduced. On the bright side, that did bring the conflict on Ancreon Sextus to a quick and decisive end, just like Van Voigt had hoped for it to happen quite some time ago. On the less positive end of things, it revealed that the enemy was still capable of some serious subterfuge and planning, as this had clearly been an attempt by Ibram Gaunt to open up perhaps a second surprise front against, well, the second front. It may also simply have been a large-scale trap, which, if Van Voigt had fell for, would have made a significant hole in the second front. Not just in the destruction, presumably, of the majority of Van Voigt's army, but the death of its commander as well, in all due likelihood. Not to mention the enormous blow to the morale of the second front that such a failure would have been. It was a disaster narrowly avoided for the second front. It also provided a reassuring explanation for why this particular battlefield saw such an enormous number of desertions. The steppe cities themselves were, well, chaos traps. Obviously, they were going to exert quite the malign influence on the soldiers fighting within them, although this did nothing to explain why the second front in general was doing so poorly. Still, it was a lot better than a disastrous defeat, and Van Voigt could now put this triumphant feather in his cap and report back to the War Master that finally some real progress had been made, that a chaos trap had been detected and destroyed before it could fully close. It also didn't hurt that Colonel Commissar Ibram Gaunt was yet again in charge of the Tarnith, first and only. And on that happy note, I will bid you adieu yet again. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.